President Clinton once called the DMZ the scariest place on Earth. It's not an exaggeration. Millions of landmines are buried across this 4-kilometer wide, 250-kilometer long strip of land. Multiple rows of electrified fencing. Guard towers with overlapping fields of fire. On both sides, soldiers stand a few hundred meters apart, trained to shoot anything that moves in the wrong direction. For most North Koreans dreaming of freedom, this is not the way out. It's the way nobody survives. But in June 2026, a single North Korean soldier did what almost no one manages to do. He crossed the most heavily militarized border on the planet, on foot, in daylight, and lived to tell about it. Stories like his make headlines. What they hide is a much bigger, much stranger truth. Almost nobody escapes North Korea through the DMZ. The real route out is 800 kilometers to the north, through a river, a forest, and a broker network that has quietly become one of the most dangerous businesses on Earth. This is how people actually escape North Korea in 2026, and why it's harder now than it's ever been. Part 1. The DMZ myth. Let's deal with the DMZ first, because it's the image everyone has in their head. Soldiers sprinting across a no man's land toward freedom. It happens. It's just vanishingly rare. The zone itself is a relic of the 1953 armistice that paused but never technically ended the Korean War. Since then, it's calcified into one of the most heavily fortified borders in the world. Dense minefields, barbed wire, electrified fencing, and tens of thousands of troops watching from both sides. Anyone attempting to cross needs to survive not just the terrain, but the reaction time of two militaries trained to assume the worst. Historically, this route has mostly been used by soldiers already stationed near the line, men who know the patrol schedules, the gaps in the minefields, and the terrain, because it's literally their job. Even then, most attempts end in death or capture. For an ordinary citizen with no military knowledge of the zone, trying to cross the DMZ isn't really an escape plan. It's closer to a coin flip with a landmine. That's why almost nobody who actually gets out of North Korea uses this route. The real story is happening 800 kilometers away, along a river most people have never heard of. Part 2. The river. Nobody talks about. North Korea shares a long, winding border with China, most of it defined by the Yalu and Tumen rivers. In parts of the Tumen especially, the water runs shallow enough in winter to walk across, assuming you don't freeze to death first, and assuming the border guards a few hundred meters away don't see you. This is the route roughly 76 to 84% of defectors actually use, according to interviews conducted with North Koreans who reach China or South Korea. It's also why geography decides your odds before you ever take a single step. Someone living in Pyongyang, heavily surveilled, screened for loyalty, and roughly 600 kilometers from the nearest usable crossing point, starts this journey from about the worst possible position in the country. The people who actually make it out overwhelmingly come from the northern provinces that border China, where the river is close, smuggling networks already exist, and the terrain is at least somewhat familiar. Crossing the river is the easy part, relatively speaking. What comes after is the real test. But just for part 3, China isn't safe. It's just a different danger. Here's the part most people don't expect. Reaching Chinese soil doesn't mean you're safe. China does not recognize North Koreans as refugees. Under a repatriation agreement with Pyongyang, anyone caught is treated as an illegal economic migrant and sent back, where forced labor, imprisonment, or worse is waiting. So defectors don't surface in China. They disappear into it. Some hide for months. Many hide for years, moving between safe houses, working off the books, avoiding checkpoints, always listening for the knock that means they've been reported. This is where a chilling and specific danger appears, one that disproportionately targets women, who made up roughly 88% of the defectors who reached South Korea in 2025. Trafficking rings operate specifically at this stage of the journey, preying on people who have no legal status, no local language, and nowhere to turn if something goes wrong. Then there's the broker system itself. Defectors, cut off from any independent way to navigate a foreign country, have no real choice but to trust guides who know the roads, the safe houses, and the checkpoints to avoid. For a fee, these brokers can be a lifeline. But the same desperation that makes defectors dependent on brokers has created a market for exploitation. Smugglers who invent non-existent new routes, extract more money at every stage of the journey, or simply vanish with a family's life savings. What used to be scattered scam attempts has, by multiple accounts, hardened into a genuine underground economy, with some brokers openly justifying the deception as simply how business works, in a system with no legal recourse for the victims. If a defector survives all of that, the journey still isn't over. It's barely a third done. Part 4. The 3,000-mile detour. Because China will send defectors straight back to North Korea, almost none of them try to fly out of Chinese territory directly, even though Seoul is less than 2 hours away by plane. Instead, they go the long way, a roughly 3,000-mile underground railroad south through China, then across the border into Laos, Vietnam, or Cambodia, sometimes routing through Thailand, where the calculus finally changes in their favor. Thailand doesn't want North Korean defectors to stay, but crucially, it doesn't forcibly send them back to North Korea either. Once a defector reaches Thai territory and turns themselves into authorities, they're typically detained, processed, and through coordination with South Korean diplomatic channels, eventually flown to Seoul. That final flight is the moment everything changes. But getting to that airport means months, sometimes years, of buses, overnight walks through mountain terrain, riverboat crossings, and long stretches hiding in the dark near border checkpoints, always calculating the odds of the next patrol. One woman who made this journey described the fear in 3 words: the thought of getting so close, only to be caught in Laos with nothing left. There is a rarer alternative that's grown more common recently: the sea route. Some defectors near the coast pose as fishermen, study patrol patterns for months, and make a run for the northern limit line, the disputed maritime border with South Korea, hoping to be spotted by a South Korean naval patrol before a North Korean one catches them. It's a route that requires almost military-grade planning, and it remains one of the few paths that doesn't require trusting a broker with your life. Part 5. Why 2026 is harder than ever. Here's the number that says everything. In 2025, only 224 North Korean defectors reached South Korea. Compare that to the peak year of 2009, when nearly 2,900 made it out. That's not a decline, it's a collapse of roughly 92%. Multiple forces have converged to nearly seal the border shut. Since the pandemic, North Korea has kept its border with China locked down far more tightly than before, with new fencing, expanded patrols, and shoot-on-sight orders in some areas. South Korean officials have noted that most recent arrivals aren't fresh escapees at all. They're people who already made it to China or a third country years ago, and only recently completed the final leg to Seoul. In other words, the pipeline of brand new escapes has slowed to a trickle, even as the backlog of people already in hiding slowly works its way through. Geopolitics has made this worse in ways that are almost impossible to imagine from the outside. North Korean soldiers sent to fight in Russia's war against Ukraine have, in some cases, been taken prisoner, and now face the terrifying prospect of being handed back to Pyongyang as part of a prisoner exchange, where capture instead of suicide is treated by the regime as an act of betrayal. Human rights advocates have raised alarms at international forums, including the Geneva Summit for Human Rights, warning that repatriation in that context isn't really a prisoner exchange. It's effectively a death sentence. Minder answered Part 6, what happens if you make it? For the small number who complete the journey, arrival in South Korea isn't the end of the story. It's the start of a very different, very difficult one. New arrivals are first taken to a government-run protection center for around 3 months of interviews and processing, partly to confirm their identity and partly to screen for anyone sent by the North. After that, the South Korean government provides a resettlement payment, housing support, and hwangwon for defectors under 30, funded education and healthcare access. But money and paperwork don't undo decades of a completely different life. Defectors frequently describe the disorientation of adjusting to a hyper-competitive, unfamiliar society, and the guilt of having left family behind, never knowing if they'll be punished for someone else's escape. One defector who reached the South in 2023 stood before an international human rights summit in early 2026 and described her homeland in stark terms, a place where a dictator's power is treated as sacred while ordinary citizens' hunger is treated as irrelevant. Closing. So how do you actually escape North Korea in 2026? The honest answer is, with extraordinary luck, a huge amount of money, months or years of hiding, and a willingness to trust strangers who might just as easily betray you as save you. It is not a heist, it's not a sprint across a minefield in the dark. It's a years-long war of nerves fought mostly in the shadows of a country that isn't even trying to kill you, while trying not to get sent back to the one that is. 224 people made it in 2025. Millions more are still waiting for a route that, right now, barely exists. End of script. What happens if you make it? For the small number who complete the journey, arrival in South Korea isn't the end of the story. It's the start of a very different, very difficult one. New arrivals are first taken to a government-run protection center for around 3 months of interviews and processing, partly to confirm their identity and partly to screen for anyone sent by the North. After that, the South Korean government provides a resettlement payment, housing support, and, for defectors under 30, funded education and healthcare access. But money and paperwork don't undo decades of a completely different life. Defectors frequently describe the disorientation of adjusting to a hyper-competitive, unfamiliar society and the guilt of having left family behind, never knowing if they'll be punished for someone else's escape. One defector who reached the South in 2023 stood before an international human rights summit in early 2026 and described her homeland in stark terms, a place where a dictator's power is treated as sacred while ordinary citizens' hunger is treated as irrelevant. While we're closing. So, how do you actually escape North Korea in 2026? The honest answer is, with extraordinary luck, a huge amount of money, months or years of hiding, and a willingness to trust strangers who might just as easily betray you as save you. It is not a heist. It's not a sprint across a minefield in the dark. It's a years-long war of nerves fought mostly in the shadows of a country that isn't even trying to kill you, while trying not to get sent back to the one that is. 224 people made it in 2025. Millions more are still waiting for a route that, right now, barely exists. End of script.